The bear at dusk. The late August sun hung low in the Alaskan sky, casting long shadows across Marcus Lee's property on the outskirts of Talkeetna. At 52, Marcus had the weathered hands of a man who had spent his life fixing things others couldn't. His auto repair shop, Lee's Mechanics, sat a quarter-mile from his modest two-bedroom home, allowing him the luxury of walking to work most days. 23 years in Alaska had taught him to appreciate these final weeks of summer, when the daylight still stretched into the evening but lacked the relentless quality of June and July. Marcus wiped his hands on a shop rag as he surveyed his backyard from the kitchen window. The trash collection wouldn't come until morning, but he'd already set the bin out by the edge of the property, where the gravel driveway met the dirt road. Old habits from his days in Oregon, where the garbage truck came at dawn. He rolled his shoulders, feeling the familiar ache that came after a day hunched over engines. The McKinley diner would be serving dinner for another hour, and the thought of Diane's meatloaf sounded better than the frozen pizza in his freezer. His phone rang, and he recognized his daughter's number. Lily had moved to Anchorage for college 4 years ago and stayed after getting a job with an environmental engineering firm. "Hey, kiddo," he answered, tucking the phone between his ear and shoulder as he continued to clean grease from under his fingernails. "Dad, did you remember that I'm coming up this weekend?" Lily's voice had the patient tone she used when she suspected he'd forgotten something. "Course I did," Marcus lied, glancing at the calendar hanging by the refrigerator, where nothing was written for the coming weekend. "Got your room all ready." "You're a terrible liar," Lily laughed. "But that's okay. I just wanted to make sure you'll be around. I'm bringing Scott." Marcus paused. Scott was new. She'd mentioned him a few times in their weekly calls, but bringing him to Talkeetna meant something. "The wildlife biologist?" he asked, trying to recall the details she'd shared. "That's him. He's doing some research near Denali and has never been to Talkeetna. I thought it would be nice to show him around, meet you." "Sounds good," Marcus said, though he felt the familiar tightness in his chest that came whenever Lily's life took another step away from his. "I'll clean up the spare room. What time are you getting in?" "Probably around noon on Saturday. I was thinking we could go to the Roadhouse for lunch." "Perfect. They still make those sourdough pancakes you like," Marcus said, his mind already shifting to what needed cleaning before they arrived. "Call me when you're on the way." After they hung up, Marcus looked at the time and decided he'd skip the diner after all. If Lily was bringing someone home, he needed to get the house in order. The spare room had become a dumping ground for clean laundry he hadn't bothered to put away, and boxes of old car manuals he kept meaning to organize. He opened the refrigerator, pulling out a container of leftover moose stew from earlier in the week. As he set it on the counter, a movement outside the window caught his eye. At the edge of his property, a large form lumbered toward his trash bin. "Son of a bitch," Marcus muttered, immediately recognizing the rounded hump and dish-shaped face of a grizzly bear. This wasn't unusual for Talkeetna, especially in late summer when bears were in hyperphagia, eating constantly to prepare for hibernation. But it was the first time one had ventured this close to his house. Most stayed in the woods that bordered the eastern edge of his property. Marcus knew the protocols. He'd lived in bear country long enough. Stay inside. Don't approach. Call the Department of Fish and Game if the bear became a nuisance. But those trash bins were expensive, and he'd just replaced one last spring after a black bear had demolished it. He watched as the grizzly rose on its hind legs, easily 7 feet tall, and batted at the bin. The bear was large but not massive, probably a young male, 4 or 5 years old enough to be dangerous, young enough to still be learning the boundaries between wilderness and human habitation. Marcus grabbed the air horn he kept in the utility drawer. Bears typically wanted no part of humans and would run off when startled. He'd used this technique before with black bears, though never with a grizzly. Still, the trash bin was a good 50 yards from his back door. He could give a blast. The bear would run, and he'd drag the bin closer to the house for the night. He opened the door and stepped onto his back deck. The evening air felt cooler than it had when he'd walked home from the shop an hour ago. The grizzly had knocked the bin onto its side and was pawing at the lid, which was still secured with a bungee cord specifically designed to deter bears. "Hey!" Marcus called out, his voice firm but not panicked. He raised the air horn above his head and gave it a blast. The bear flinched at the sound and dropped to all fours, but instead of running away, it turned toward Marcus. The animal's small eyes locked on him, and Marcus felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. He'd expected the bear to bolt for the trees. This wasn't following the script. Marcus stood very still. The bear seemed to be assessing him, head slightly lowered. Neither moved for what felt like minutes but was likely only seconds. Then the bear huffed, a sound somewhere between a sneeze and a grunt, and turned back to the trash bin. It swiped at the container with a massive paw, the claws leaving deep gouges in the plastic as the bungee cord snapped. Marcus should have gone back inside. Any Alaskan worth their salt knew better than to challenge a bear, especially a grizzly. But the bear's dismissal of him triggered something, a territorial instinct, a stubborn refusal to be intimidated on his own property. He raised the air horn again and gave it another blast, longer this time. The grizzly spun toward him with surprising speed. It huffed again, this time with a low growl that Marcus could feel in his chest more than hear. The bear took a step, toward him, then another. Suddenly Marcus's confidence evaporated. He backed up slowly toward his door, keeping his eyes on the bear, but not making direct eye contact, which could be perceived as a challenge. The grizzly advanced a few more steps, then stopped, still a good 30 yards away. "Easy there," Marcus said, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through him. "I'm going inside now. You can have the damn trash." He took another step backward, his hand finding the doorknob behind him. The bear remained where it was, watching. Marcus opened the door, intending to slip inside, when his phone rang in his pocket. The suddenness of the ringtone in the tense silence startled both man and bear. The grizzly charged. In the stories Marcus had heard about bear charges, time slowed down. For him, the opposite happened. Everything accelerated. The bear covered the ground between them with terrifying speed. Marcus threw himself through the doorway, but he wasn't fast enough. He felt a searing pain across his left shoulder as the bear's claws caught him, the force spinning him around and sending him sprawling onto the kitchen floor. He kicked the door shut with his foot and scrambled backward, expecting the bear to burst through at any moment. Nothing happened. Through the window, he could see the grizzly standing on his deck, sniffing the air where his blood now stained the wooden boards. Marcus touched his shoulder, and his hand came away red. The pain hit him then, a burning sensation that ran from his shoulder halfway down his back. He couldn't see the wound, but the amount of blood soaking through his flannel shirt told him it was bad. His phone was still ringing. With a shaking hand, he pulled it from his pocket. Lily calling back about something. He declined the call and dialed 911. 911, what's your emergency? The operator's voice was calm, practiced. "I've been attacked by a bear," Marcus said, surprised by how level his own voice sounded. "It's still outside my house." "Are you safe now, sir?" "I'm inside. The bear is on my deck." "Are you injured?" "Yes, it got my shoulder. I'm bleeding pretty bad." "What's your location?" Marcus gave her his address, the familiar numbers and street names sounding strange in this context. "I'm dispatching." "Emergency services now," the operator said. "Can you apply pressure to the wound?" Marcus looked around. The kitchen towel hanging from the stove was within reach. He grabbed it and pressed it against his shoulder, wincing at the pressure. "I'm doing that now," he said. "Good, stay on the line with me until help arrives." "What's your name, sir?" "Marcus Lee." "Okay, Marcus, emergency services are on their way. It might take them about 15 minutes to reach you. Is the bleeding slowing with pressure?" Marcus lifted the towel slightly. "No, it's soaking through. Pretty quick. Do you have a first aid kit in the house?" "In the bathroom." Marcus started to stand. "Stay where you are if you can see the bear from there," the operator cautioned. "Is there anyone else in the house who can get the kit for you?" "No, I live alone." Marcus glanced out the window. The bear had moved off the deck and was back at the trash bin, which was now spilling its contents onto the ground. The bears moved away from the door. "I think I can make it to the bathroom." "Be very careful. If the bear comes back toward the house, get somewhere secure immediately." Marcus placed the phone on speaker and set it on the counter. He rose slowly, keeping pressure on his shoulder with the now soaked towel. The movement sent fresh waves of pain radiating across his back and down his arm. He made his way down the short hallway to the bathroom, glancing back toward the kitchen window to make sure the bear remained occupied. The first aid kit was under the sink, a comprehensive one he'd put together years ago when Lily used to go hiking with him. He set it on the counter and opened it one-handed, awkwardly retrieving gauze pads and medical tape. "I've got the first aid kit," he called out. loud enough for the phone to pick up his voice from the other room. "Good," the operator replied. "Do you have large absorbent pads or just small gauze?" "Both. Use the largest ones you have, apply them directly to the wound, and secure them with tape if you can." Marcus removed his shirt with difficulty, grunting as the fabric pulled away from the wound. In the bathroom mirror, he got his first look at the damage. 3 deep gashes ran diagonally across his left shoulder blade, the middle one the deepest. The edges were ragged, and blood continued to flow freely from all 3. "Christ," he muttered. "What's happening, Marcus?" the operator asked. "Just seeing the cuts for the first time, it's not pretty." He pressed the largest gauze pads against the wounds and tried to secure them with medical tape, but the awkward angle in the blood made it difficult for the tape to stick. "I'm having trouble getting the bandages to stay," he said, frustration edging into his voice. "That's okay. Just keep applying pressure until help arrives. They're on their way to you now. Can you still see the bear?" Marcus walked back to the kitchen, holding the gauze in place with his right hand. Through the window, he could see the grizzly methodically going through the trash, occasionally raising its head to sniff the air. "Yeah, it's still out there, eating my garbage." "Okay, I need you to stay away from windows and doors. Find somewhere to sit and keep pressure on that wound." Marcus lowered himself onto one of the kitchen chairs, positioning it so he could see out the window while staying back from it. The blood had soaked through the gauze already, and he was starting to feel lightheaded. The pain had settled into a constant burning throb that intensified with each heartbeat. "I think I'm going into shock," he said, recognizing the symptoms from his wilderness first aid training. "Getting dizzy, cold. Try to stay warm. Can you reach a blanket or jacket?" "No, not without getting up." "That's okay, just focus on keeping pressure on the wound. Help will be there soon." Marcus's vision began to tunnel slightly at the edges. He focused on his breathing, trying to stay calm. Outside, the bear had finished with the trash and was moving around to the side of the house, disappearing from view. Marcus felt a new surge of panic. "I can't see the bear anymore. It went around the side of the house." "Stay where you are. Emergency services should be arriving any minute." "Do you hear any sirens yet?" Marcus listened. In the distance, he could just make out the faint wail of an approaching vehicle. "Yeah, I think so." "Good. They'll be careful about the bear. Your job right now is to stay conscious and keep pressure on that wound." The sirens grew louder, and soon Marcus could see flashing lights reflecting off the trees at the end of his driveway. The emergency. Vehicles stopped short of his house, and he heard car doors opening and closing. "They're here," he told the operator. "Excellent. I'm going to stay on the line until they're inside with you." Marcus heard voices outside, then a cautious knock at his front door, which was on the opposite side of the house from where he'd last seen the bear. "Mr. Lee?" a male voice called. "Alaska State Troopers, we're coming in." "It's unlocked," Marcus called back, his voice weaker than he expected. The front door opened, and 2 figures entered cautiously. A state trooper with his hand on his sidearm and a paramedic carrying a large kit. "The bear was last seen on the east side of the house," the trooper said into his radio. "We're inside with the victim." The paramedic rushed to Marcus's side, setting down her kit and immediately examining the wounds on his shoulder. "I'm Sarah," she said, pulling on gloves. "I need to take a look at these cuts, okay?" Marcus nodded, letting her take over, applying pressure with fresh, sterile pads. "You did a good job," she said, noting his attempts at bandaging. "These are deep, though. You're going to need stitches, and we need to get this bleeding under control." The trooper approached, keeping his distance to give the paramedic room to work. "I'm Officer Daniels. Can you tell me what happened?" Marcus gave him a brief account of the encounter, while Sarah worked on his shoulder, cleaning the wounds with antiseptic that stung worse than the initial injury. "A grizzly, you said?" Officer Daniels confirmed, making notes. "Yeah, young male, I think. Maybe 400 pounds. Did you approach it?" Marcus hesitated. "Not exactly. It was getting into my trash. I tried to scare it off with an air horn." The officer nodded, his expression carefully neutral. "We'll need a full statement later, but for now, let's get you to the hospital." The bear was gone when we arrived, but we've got fish and wildlife on the way to check the area. Sarah had managed to slow the bleeding and was applying thick pressure bandages. "His blood pressure is dropping," she said to someone behind her. "We need to move him now." Another paramedic had entered with a stretcher. Together they helped Marcus onto it, the movement sending fresh stabs of pain through his shoulder. "What about the bear?" Marcus asked as they secured him. "Don't worry about that right now," Officer Daniels said. Fish and wildlife will handle it. They may need to track it if it shows aggressive behavior toward humans. The thought of the bear being destroyed because of his poor judgment made Marcus's stomach twist. It was just doing what bears do, he said. I shouldn't have tried to scare it off. The officer didn't respond to that, just held the door as the paramedics wheeled Marcus out. The evening had darkened considerably in the time since the attack. Multiple vehicles were now parked in his driveway, an ambulance, 2 police cruisers, and a Department of Fish and Game truck that had just pulled up. As they loaded him into the ambulance, Marcus caught sight of a man in a fish and game uniform, examining the area around his trash bins with a powerful flashlight. Matsu Regional? One paramedic asked the other, as they secured the stretcher inside the ambulance. Yeah, it's the closest trauma center. The doors closed, and Sarah hooked Marcus up to an IV. I'm going to give you something for the pain, she said, injecting medication into the line. You're going to be okay, but those are serious lacerations. You'll likely need surgery to repair the muscle damage. The pain medication worked quickly, dulling the fire in his shoulder to a manageable ache. As the ambulance pulled away, Marcus thought about Lily. He'd need to call her once they reached the hospital. She would worry, might even insist on coming up early. And then there was his shop. He had 3 vehicles scheduled for tomorrow that would need to be rescheduled. My phone, he said suddenly. It's still in the house. We can worry about that later, Sarah assured him, checking his vital signs. Right now we need to focus on getting you treated. The adrenaline was wearing off, and between the blood loss and the medication, Marcus felt himself drifting. The last thing he remembered before losing consciousness was the rhythmic wail of the siren and Sarah's voice, calm but urgent, speaking into a radio about blood type and surgical prep. He woke to the harsh fluorescent lighting of a hospital room. For a moment he couldn't remember why he was there. Then the pain in his shoulder flared as he tried to move, and it all came rushing back, the bear, the charge, the claws raking across his back. A nurse noticed he was awake and approached. The bed. Mr. Lee, how are you feeling? Like I lost a fight with a chainsaw, Marcus replied, his mouth dry. How bad is it? The doctor will be in shortly to discuss your injuries, but you're stable. You lost a significant amount of blood and required surgery to repair muscle damage in your shoulder. You also received numerous stitches. She checked the monitors beside his bed. Would you like some water? Marcus nodded, and she helped him take a few sips through a straw. The clock on the wall read 2:17 a.m. How long was I out? He asked. You've been here about 5 hours. You were in surgery for most of that time. She adjusted something on his IV line. The doctor gave orders for pain medication every 4 hours. You're due for your next dose soon. Marcus was about to ask another question when the door opened and a tall, gray-haired man in scrubs entered. Mr. Lee, I'm Dr. Harrison. I performed your surgery. He moved to the bedside and checked the bandages visible at the edge of Marcus's hospital gown. The good news is that while the lacerations were deep, they missed any major blood vessels. The bad news is that there was significant muscle damage to your trapezius and some minor damage to your deltoid. What does that mean long-term? Marcus asked, thinking about his work at the shop. With proper physical therapy, you should regain most of your functionality, but it will take time. You'll have some scarring, of course, and you may experience some chronic pain or weakness in that shoulder. Dr. Harrison made a note in the chart. You were lucky. Bear attacks are often much worse. Doesn't feel lucky, Marcus muttered. I understand, but trust me, I've seen the aftermath of more serious attacks. The doctor's expression was grave. We'll keep you here for at least 2 days to monitor for infection. Bear claws carry a lot of bacteria. You're on strong antibiotics now, and we'll send you home with a prescription. I need to call my daughter, Marcus said, suddenly remembering. And my shop. I need to reschedule some appointments. Your daughter has already been notified, the nurse interjected. The state troopers contacted her as your emergency contact. She called the hospital about an hour ago and is driving up from Anchorage in the morning. That was one worry addressed, at least. What about my phone? All my business contacts are in it. The officers mentioned they'd secure your house. I believe they were going to bring your personal effects in the morning. Dr. Harrison checked Marcus's vital signs once more. For now, try to rest. The nurse will give you your next dose of pain medication, which will likely make you drowsy again. After the doctor left, the nurse administered the medication as promised. Marcus felt the relief spread through him, dulling the sharp pain in his shoulder to a manageable throb. Despite his concerns about his business and the lingering questions about the bear, he found himself drifting off again, the exhaustion of trauma pulling him under. He dreamed of the bear, but in his dream, it wasn't attacking. It was just watching him from the edge of the woods, its small eyes intelligent and assessing. When he woke again, sunlight was streaming through the hospital room window, and Lily was sitting in a chair beside his bed, her face drawn with worry. "Dad," she said, leaning forward when she saw his eyes open. "How are you feeling?" "Been better," Marcus admitted. He tried to shift to see her better and winced at the movement. "You didn't have to drive up early." "Of course I did. You were attacked by a bear." Her voice caught slightly. "The trooper who called said you were lucky to get inside when you did." Marcus didn't feel particularly lucky, but he nodded. "Is Scott with you?" "He's in the cafeteria getting coffee." He insisted on coming. She took his hand, the one not connected to the IV. "What were you thinking, Dad?" "You know better." "I went to confront a grizzly." The disappointment in her voice stung worse than the antiseptic on his wounds. "I wasn't thinking," he admitted, "just reacting. It was going after the trash bin and I thought I could scare it off." "With an air horn? Seriously?" Lily shook her head. "You're the one who lectured me about bear safety my entire childhood." I know, it was stupid. Beyond stupid, you could have been killed." Her eyes welled up. "When that trooper called, I thought—" She trailed off, unable to finish the thought. "I'm sorry, kiddo. Really." He squeezed her hand. "But—" "I'm okay. Banged up, but okay." Lily wiped at her eyes with her free hand. "The doctor said you'll need physical therapy, and that you'll have some pretty impressive scars." "Chicks dig scars, right?" Marcus attempted a smile, trying to lighten the mood. "Not funny, Dad." But the corner of her mouth twitched slightly. A knock at the door interrupted them, and a man Marcus didn't recognize entered carrying 2 coffee cups. He was in his early 30s, with a neatly trimmed beard and the outdoorsy look of someone who spent more time in the wilderness than in offices. "You must be Scott," Marcus said. "Yes, sir. Scott Reynolds." He handed one of the coffees to Lily and approached the bed. "I'm sorry about what happened. How are you feeling?" "Like I tangled with the wrong end of a grizzly," Marcus replied dryly. Scott nodded, his expression sympathetic but not pitying. "I've worked with bears for almost a decade, and I still wouldn't want to be on the receiving end of those claws. Mind if I ask what happened?" Marcus recounted the events again, feeling increasingly foolish with each telling. Scott listened without interrupting, occasionally nodding. "The bear didn't follow you into the house?" he asked when Marcus finished. "No, it stayed outside, went back to the trash after." "That's actually significant," Scott said. "It suggests the bear wasn't hunting you. It was defending a food source. A predatory bear would likely have pursued you." Before Marcus could respond, there was another knock, and Officer Daniels from the night before entered, accompanied by a woman in a Department of Fish and Game uniform. "Mr. Lee, glad to see you're awake," Officer Daniels said. "This is Officer Martinez from Fish and Game. She'd like to ask you some questions about the incident, if you're up to it." Marcus nodded, and Officer Martinez stepped forward. She was middle-aged with salt and pepper hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. "Mr. Lee, I'm following up on the bear encounter from last night. We need to file a complete report." She glanced at Lily and Scott. "Would you prefer to speak privately?" "They can stay," Marcus said. "My daughter and her—" He looked at Lily, not sure how to label Scott. "Boyfriend," Lily supplied, and Scott nodded in confirmation. "My daughter and her boyfriend," Marcus continued. "Scott actually works with bears, apparently." Officer Martinez looked at Scott with more interest. "Oh? In what capacity?" "I'm a wildlife biologist with the University of Alaska. My research focuses on bear behavior and human-wildlife conflict." "Well, that's fortunate. Your insights might be helpful." She turned back to Marcus. "Mr. Lee, I need you to walk me through exactly what happened. And please be completely honest, even if you think you made mistakes. Our goal isn't to assign blame, but to understand the encounter." Marcus recounted the story for what felt like the 10th time, trying to be as detailed and accurate as possible. Officer Martinez took notes and occasionally asked clarifying questions. "So you weren't aware of the bear-resistant trash protocol for your area?" she asked, after he mentioned the bungee cord he'd used. Marcus felt his face warm. "I knew about it. Just didn't think it was necessary since I've never had a grizzly come that close to the house before." "I see." Her tone was neutral. "And the air horn, you've used this successfully with black bears in the past?" "Yes, a couple of times. They always ran off." Grizzlies and black bears often respond differently to deterrence, Officer Martinez explained. Black bears are typically more timid around humans. Grizzlies, especially when they're defending food, can be more aggressive. Scott nodded. That's consistent with my research. Black bears usually have a flight response to loud noises, while grizzlies may perceive it as a challenge, particularly if they're already invested in a food source. Officer Martinez made another note. We located and tracked the bear after the incident. Based on paw prints and your description, it's a young male, probably around 5 years old. He moved off into the woods east of your property and showed no signs of seeking out human contact again. You're not going to, Marcus made a gun gesture with his hand. Euthanize it? No, not based on this incident. The bear behaved in a predictable manner when challenged over food. It didn't stalk you or enter your home. It didn't even continue the attack once you were no longer a perceived threat. She closed her notebook. However, we will be monitoring the area more closely, and we'll be enforcing proper bear-resistant container regulations more strictly in your neighborhood. Marcus nodded, relieved that the bear wouldn't be destroyed because of his poor judgment. I brought your phone and some personal items from your house, Officer Daniels added, placing a small bag on the bedside table. Your house is secure. We also contacted your nearest neighbor, Mr. Peterson, who said he'd keep an eye on the property until you return. Thanks, Marcus said. I appreciate that. One more thing, Officer Martinez said. The Anchorage Daily News picked up the story. They've been running a series on human-wildlife interactions, and a reporter may contact you. You're under no obligation to speak with them, of course. Marcus groaned. Great. Just what I need to be the poster child for what not to do in bear country. Actually, your experience could help educate others, Scott chimed in. Most bear encounters that make the news are either fatal or involve tourists who have no idea about proper protocol. Your story shows that even experienced locals can make mistakes, which is an important reminder for everyone in bear country. I'd rather not be famous for being an idiot, Marcus grumbled. We'll leave you to rest, Officer Martinez said, apparently sensing his discomfort. I'll file my report today. You may be contacted by our education department about participating in community bear safety programs, but again, that's entirely voluntary. After the officers left, Marcus sighed and closed his eyes briefly. I'm never going to live this down in town. Probably not, Lily agreed, but her tone was gentler now. But at least you're alive to be embarrassed about it. And on the bright side, you've got a great story now, Scott added. In Alaska, a bear encounter is practically a rite of passage. I could have done without this particular initiation, Marcus said, but he found himself smiling slightly. The next day passed in a blur of medical checks, pain medication, and visitors. Word had spread quickly in the small town of Talkeetna, and several of Marcus's friends and customers stopped by. To his surprise, they were more concerned than judgmental, though there was plenty of good-natured ribbing about his lapse in bear protocol. Dr. Harrison checked his wounds and seemed pleased with his progress. No signs of infection so far. The antibiotics are doing their job. He examined the surgical site carefully. The sutures look good. You'll have 3 distinct scars, but they should fade somewhat with time. Will I need plastic surgery? Marcus asked, not particularly concerned about his appearance but worried about function. I don't think so. These are clean lacerations, and the surgical repair was straightforward. The scarring shouldn't restrict movement once you've completed physical therapy. Dr. Harrison made some notes in his chart. I think we can discharge you tomorrow morning if all continues to go well. You'll need someone to stay with you for a few days, though. I'll be there, Lily said immediately. What about Scott's visit? Marcus asked. I don't want to ruin your plans. Believe it or not, observing the aftermath of a grizzly attack is actually relevant to my research, Scott said with a smile. Besides, I came to meet you. This just gives us more time to get acquainted. In the afternoon, a reporter from the Anchorage Daily News called Marcus's cell phone. Against Lily's advice, he agreed to answer a few questions. Mr. Lee, I understand. You had an encounter with a grizzly bear at your home in Talkeetna, the reporter began. Can you tell me what happened? Marcus gave her the basics, emphasizing his own mistake in confronting the bear. Would you say this is an example of increasing bear activity in residential areas of Alaska? She asked. I wouldn't draw any big conclusions from it, Marcus replied cautiously. Bears have always been around Talkeetna. This one was just hungrier or bolder than most. Fish and Game reports that improper garbage storage is the #1 attractant for bears in residential areas. Was your trash secured in a bear-resistant container? Marcus winced. No, it wasn't. I had a bungee cord on it, but not a proper bear-resistant bin. That was my mistake, and I'll be fixing it as soon as I get home. Do you think local authorities should be doing more to enforce bear-safe protocols in communities like Talkeetna? I think people like me should be taking the existing protocols more seriously, Marcus answered, not wanting to shift blame. The information is out there. I just got complacent. The interview continued for a few more minutes, with Marcus trying to steer the conversation away from sensationalism and toward personal responsibility. When he hung up, Lily gave him an approving nod. That was actually pretty good, Dad, very responsible. Well, I've had a lot of time to think about how stupid I was, Marcus said. Might as well own it. The story ran in the next day's paper, a small piece on page 3 titled, "Talkeetna Man Injured in Bear Encounter, Emphasizes Garbage Security." It was factual and brief, focusing more on bear safety tips than on Marcus's experience. To his relief, they didn't include a photo of him, just a stock image of a grizzly bear and a sidebar about proper trash storage in bear country. As promised, Marcus was discharged the following morning with a prescription for antibiotics, pain medication, and instructions for wound care. The doctor also provided a referral to a physical therapist in Talkeetna and a schedule for follow-up appointments. Remember, no lifting with that arm for at least 3 weeks, Dr. Harrison emphasized. And physical therapy isn't optional if you want to regain full function. I understand, Marcus said, wincing as the nurse helped him into a button-up shirt that Lily had brought from his house. His left arm was immobilized in a sling to prevent him from stretching the fresh sutures. The drive back to Talkeetna was quiet, with Lily behind the wheel of Marcus's truck and Scott following in Lily's car. Marcus watched the familiar landscape pass by, the late summer foliage beginning to show hints of the golden red that would dominate in a few weeks. He felt a strange mix of emotions: embarrassment over his poor judgment, gratitude for his relatively minor injuries given what could have happened, and a newfound respect for the wild creatures he shared this land with. When they arrived at his house, the first thing Marcus noticed was the new bear-resistant trash bin sitting where his old one had been destroyed. "Did you order this?" he asked Lily as she helped him out of the truck. "Wasn't me," she said. "Maybe one of your friends?" The mystery was solved when Jim Peterson, Marcus's nearest neighbor whose property began about a quarter-mile down the road, walked over from where he'd been waiting in his pickup. "Thought you might need a replacement," Jim said, nodding at the new bin. "Town pitched in. Consider it a get-well present." Marcus was touched by the gesture. Thank you. Please, thank everyone for me." "Will do," Jim replied. "Got any pictures of those wounds yet? Bet they'll make some impressive scars." Lily rolled her eyes. "He just got out of the hospital, Jim. Maybe hold off on the scar competition until he's healed." Jim laughed. "Fair enough. Just wanted to make sure. You got home okay? Let me know if you need anything." He looked at the woods that bordered Marcus's property. "I've been keeping an eye out, but there's been no sign of your bear friend since that night." "Good," Marcus said, though a part of him wondered where the grizzly was now, whether it had moved deeper into the wilderness or found another neighborhood with less secure trash bins to raid. Inside, Marcus found that his house had been cleaned up. The blood-stained kitchen floor was spotless, and someone had even stocked his refrigerator with casseroles and prepared meals. "The Talkeetna Welcoming Committee strikes again," Lily explained when he commented on it. "Mrs. Daniels from the bakery organized a meal train for you. Apparently bear attack victims get the same treatment as new mothers." Marcus chuckled, then regretted it as the movement pulled at his stitches. "I guess there are worse ways to be welcomed back." Over the next 2 days, Marcus settled into a new routine. Lily and Scott stayed in the spare room, with Scott making himself useful by installing motion detector lights around the property and helping Marcus figure out how to manage daily tasks one-handed. Lily contacted Marcus's customers and arranged for a mechanic from Anchorage to cover the most urgent repairs at his shop for the next 2 weeks. Word of Marcus's encounter spread through Talkeetna, and soon he found himself reluctantly holding court at the McKinley Diner when he ventured out for lunch 3 days after returning home. The other patrons wanted to hear the story firsthand, and despite his initial embarrassment, Marcus found that telling it became easier each time. He emphasized his mistakes and what he should have done differently. turning the experience into a cautionary tale rather than an adventure story. "Should have seen the other guy," he joked when Diane, the diner's owner, asked about his injuries. The line got a laugh, as he knew it would. Alaskans appreciated gallows humor, especially when it came to the inherent dangers of their lifestyle. "Fish and Game says there's been more bear activity than usual this summer," Pete, the local hardware store owner, commented. "Berry crop was weak this year because of the dry spell in July." "That's true," Scott confirmed, having joined the conversation. "When natural food sources are scarce, bears are more likely to explore human areas for alternatives." "Still shouldn't have tried to run it off myself," Marcus admitted. "Should have called it in and stayed inside." "Hindsight's always clearer," Jim Peterson said from his usual booth. "But maybe next time you'll remember this conversation before you go charging after a grizzly with nothing but an air horn and your winning personality." This drew more laughter, and Marcus found himself grinning despite the persistent ache in his shoulder. There was something therapeutic about the community's response, the blend of concern, practical help, and good-natured teasing that acknowledged the seriousness of what had happened while refusing to treat him as either a victim or a fool. A week after the attack, Marcus had his first physical therapy appointment. The therapist, a no-nonsense woman named Rita, assessed his range of motion and the healing progress of his wounds. "You're lucky," she said, echoing what everyone else had told him. "The muscle damage is significant but repairable. With consistent therapy, you should regain most of your function." "Most?" Marcus questioned. "You'll likely have some persistent weakness in certain movements, particularly overhead lifting, and there may be weather-related pain as you age. Many old injuries ache when the barometric pressure changes." She demonstrated some gentle exercises. "But if you're diligent with your rehabilitation, you'll be able to return to most normal activities, including your work." The physical therapy was painful and frustrating. Simple movements that Marcus had taken for granted now required conscious effort, and he often reached the point of exhaustion long before completing Rita's prescribed exercise routine. But he persisted, determined to recover as much function as possible. Lily and Scott extended their stay, with Scott taking advantage of the proximity to Denali National Park to conduct some field research while Lily helped Marcus with daily tasks and drove him to appointments. Their relationship was clearly serious, and Marcus found himself warming to Scott, whose extensive knowledge of bears and wildlife management provided a different perspective on his encounter. "You know, in some cultures, a bear encounter is considered spiritually significant," Scott mentioned. One evening as they sat on Marcus's deck, the new motion detector lights illuminating the yard at regular intervals when small animals triggered them. "It represents a confrontation with something powerful and primal in yourself. In my culture, it represents not being an idiot about garbage storage," Marcus replied dryly, but he found himself thinking about the moment when he'd locked eyes with the grizzly, that split second of connection before fear and instinct took over. 2 weeks. After the attack, the sutures were removed. The wounds had healed well, with no sign of infection. 3 distinct scars ran diagonally across Marcus's left shoulder blade, the middle one the widest and most prominent. They were still red and raised, but the doctor assured him they would fade to silvery white over time. "These actually look quite good considering the mechanism of injury," the doctor commented. "Bear claws aren't exactly surgical instruments." Marcus couldn't see the scars directly, of course, but Lily had taken a photo so he could get a sense of their appearance. Looking at the image, he felt a strange mix of emotions, a lingering embarrassment over his poor judgment, but also a certain pride. These marks were part of his Alaska story now. Physical evidence of a wild encounter survived. As his recovery progressed, Marcus began spending more time at his shop, initially just supervising the mechanic from Anchorage, but gradually taking on light work himself. The familiar smells of oil and metal were comforting, the routine of diagnosis and repair a welcome distraction from the persistent discomfort in his shoulder. Most of his regular customers had heard about the bear encounter, and many asked to see the scars. Marcus obliged when appropriate, rolling up his sleeve to show the top edge of the lacerations that extended onto his upper arm. The story became a standard part of his customer service patter, a way to fill the time while writing up estimates or explaining repairs. "Actually had a grizzly try to do some body work on me," he'd say when someone asked about his sling. He wasn't union certified though, so the results were a bit rough. People usually laughed, then asked for details, and Marcus would give them the abbreviated version, always ending with a reminder about proper bear safety and garbage storage. Month after the attack, life had largely returned to normal. Lily and Scott had gone back to Anchorage, though they visited more frequently than before. Marcus had regained enough function in his arm to resume most of his work, though he still struggled with certain movements and fatigued more quickly than before. The physical therapy continued, 3 sessions a week, with Rita pushing him harder as his strength improved. The bear never returned to his property, at least not that Marcus observed. Fish and Game reported that bear activity in the area had decreased as the animals moved deeper into the wilderness to prepare for hibernation. Marcus found himself scanning the edge of the woods whenever he was outside, a new awareness of the thin boundary between his human domain and the wild world beyond. One evening in late September, as the first dusting of snow covered the highest peaks visible from his property, Marcus sat on his deck with a cup of coffee. The motion lights hadn't activated in hours, and the woods were quiet except for the occasional rustle of wind through the increasingly bare branches. His shoulder ached slightly, a combination of a hard day's work and the dropping temperature. He thought about the bear, probably miles away by now, perhaps already preparing a den for the coming winter. In a few weeks it would enter hibernation, sleeping away the harshest months, while its metabolism slowed to a crawl. By spring, when it emerged hungry and disoriented, Marcus's encounter with it would be almost forgotten by everyone except him. The scars would remain, of course, 3 distinct lines across his shoulder that would eventually fade but never disappear. Completely. They would serve as a permanent reminder of his momentary lapse in judgment, of the wild power that existed just beyond the boundaries of human settlement, and of his own vulnerability in the face of it. Marcus finished his coffee and stood wincing slightly at the stiffness in his shoulder. He took one last look at the darkened woods before heading inside, securing the door behind him, with a newfound respect for the proper barriers between his world and the wilderness. The bear had moved on, leaving nothing but scars and stories in its wake. In Alaska, perhaps that was as much closure as anyone could expect. Now let's move on to the story of the next survivor. The morning air bit at Carlos Ramirez's exposed skin as he stepped out of his rented cabin, his breath forming small clouds that dissipated quickly in the crisp Adirondack air. It was just past 6 in the morning, earlier than he typically started. His jogs back home in Albany, but something about the mountains made him eager to rise with the sun. The 33-year-old nurse had been looking forward to this solo getaway for months, 3 days of solitude in the wilderness to clear his head after a particularly grueling stretch at Albany Medical Center's intensive care unit. The small cabin he'd rented sat on the outskirts of Lake Placid, close enough to civilization for comfort, but remote enough to provide the peace he craved. Through the trees, the first golden rays of sunlight danced on the surface of a small lake, casting diamond-like reflections that shimmered and shifted with each gentle ripple. Carlos took a moment to breathe it all in, filling his lungs with the clean mountain air that smelled of pine and earth and morning dew. He stretched methodically, the routine ingrained after years of running. First his calves, then hamstrings, quadriceps, and finally his upper body. Each movement was deliberate, professional. The same attention to detail that made him an excellent nurse translated well to maintaining his physical health. Carlos had always been athletic, but running had become his sanctuary, a moving meditation that helped him process the emotional weight of working in an ICU. He'd seen too many people take their last breaths, held too many hands as monitors flatlined. The trails offered solace, a reminder that life continued beyond hospital walls. His phone buzzed in the pocket of his running jacket. Carlos pulled it out to see a text from his sister, Elena. "Don't get eaten by bears out there in the wilderness, Hermanito." Carlos smiled and shook his head. Elena had always been the worrier of the family, especially since he'd decided to take this trip alone. He typed a quick reply, "Bears are more afraid of me than I am of them. I'll check in tonight." Though he'd meant it as reassurance, Carlos had done his research before the trip. Black bears were common in the Adirondacks, with an estimated population of 6,000 to 8,000 in New York State. Unlike their more aggressive grizzly cousins in the West, black bears were typically shy and avoided human contact when possible. Still, he wasn't naive. He'd read the safety guidelines on the New York Department of Environmental Conservation website and had packed accordingly. A small canister of bear spray was clipped to his belt, an insurance policy he hoped never to cash in. The trail he'd selected for this morning's run was the Pine Meadow Loop, a moderate 5-mile path that the cabin's owner, a weathered local man named Tom Harding, had recommended. "Beautiful views," Tom had said when handing over the keys, "but stick to the marked paths. It's easy to get turned around out there if you're not familiar with these woods." Carlos adjusted his wireless earbuds, scrolled to his running playlist, and set off at an easy pace. The trail began as a wide, well-maintained path covered in pine needles that muffled his footfalls. The forest around him was still waking up. Chickadees and nuthatches flitted between branches, their cheerful calls providing a natural soundtrack beneath the rhythmic beats flowing through his earbuds. Half a mile in, the trail narrowed and began a gradual ascent. Carlos's breathing deepened as his body adjusted to the climb and the altitude. Living in Albany didn't prepare him for mountain running, but he welcomed the challenge. The burn in his legs felt good, grounding, real, so different from the antiseptic hallways and fluorescent lights of the hospital. As he rounded a bend, the forest opened up to reveal a stunning view of the surrounding mountains. The Adirondack Peaks stretched before him, their slopes covered in the rich greens of pine and spruce, interspersed with the lighter green of new deciduous growth. In the distance, wisps of morning fog clung to the valleys, giving the landscape an ethereal quality. Carlos slowed to a walk, pulled out his phone, and snapped several photos. Elena would appreciate them, and maybe they'd reassure her that he wasn't completely isolated in the wilderness. Back to his run, Carlos settled into a comfortable rhythm, his mind finally beginning to clear of the accumulated stress from work. The most recent case that had been haunting him, a 19-year-old car accident victim who hadn't made it, despite their best efforts, began to recede slightly from the forefront of his thoughts. Here, among the ancient mountains and towering trees, human troubles seemed smaller somehow. Perspective, he thought. That's what I came here for. The trail dipped down into a shallow valley before rising again toward what his trail map indicated was Pine Meadow Overlook. Carlos checked his watch. He'd been running for about 25 minutes and had covered just over 2 miles. The sun was higher now, filtering through the canopy in golden shafts that spotted the forest floor. The temperature was rising, and Carlos unzipped his jacket slightly, welcoming the cool air against his warming skin. As the path curved around a stand of large hemlocks, Carlos's attention was drawn to movement up ahead. He squinted, slowing his pace slightly. About 50 yards ahead, something dark was moving deliberately across the trail. His first thought was that it was another hiker, perhaps someone with a large backpack, but as the figure fully emerged from behind a thick tree trunk, Carlos's heart skipped. A black bear, not exceptionally large. Later, when he would replay this moment in his mind, he'd estimate it was a young adult, maybe 200 pounds, but unmistakably a bear. Its dark fur absorbed the sunlight rather than reflecting, it creating an almost silhouette-like appearance against the dappled forest backdrop. The bear moved with surprising grace for its bulk, head low to the ground, nose working constantly to process the complex tapestry of scents in its environment. Carlos froze, his runner's instincts screaming at him to turn and sprint in the opposite direction, while his rational mind, the nurse who had handled countless emergencies with calm efficiency, reminded him that running would be the worst possible response. Never run from a predator. It triggers their chase instinct. He reached slowly for his bear spray, cursing silently when he realized he'd clipped it to the opposite side of his belt, forcing him to make more movement than he wanted to. The bear, which had been moving perpendicular to the trail and showed no signs of having noticed him, suddenly stopped. Its head lifted, nose pointed skyward, testing the air. Carlos held his breath. The distance between them, 50 yards, give or take, felt simultaneously like a vast chasm and no distance at all. He knew black bears had poor eyesight, but excellent hearing and an even better sense of smell. Had it caught his scent on the morning breeze? The moment stretched, elastic with tension as bear and man engaged in a silent standoff neither had sought. The bear dropped to all fours again and continued its journey across the path, disappearing into the underbrush on the other side. Carlos released the breath he'd been holding, his heart hammering against his ribs. He waited several more minutes, scanning the area where the bear had vanished before deciding it was safe to continue, albeit at a much more cautious pace, and with one earbud removed to better hear his surroundings. As he approached the spot where the bear had crossed, Carlos noticed disturbed earth and what appeared to be partially eaten berries scattered near a bush. evidence of the bear's morning meal. He gave the area a wide berth, eyes constantly scanning the forest for any sign of movement. The encounter had shaken him more than he wanted to admit. Despite having read that black bears rarely attack humans unprovoked, the visceral reality of being so close to a wild predator had triggered something primal in his brain. Carlos considered turning back, completing a shorter loop than planned, but the stubborn part of him, the part that had pushed through years of nursing school while working nights, refused to let fear dictate his actions. He continued toward Pine Meadow Overlook, his pace slower now, senses heightened. Every snapping twig and rustling leaf registered in his consciousness. The forest, which had seemed so peaceful just minutes before, now felt charged with potential danger. Carlos reminded himself that he was, statistically speaking, in very little danger. Black bear attacks were exceedingly rare, with only about one fatal attack per year in all of North America. The trail steepened as it approached the overlook, and Carlos's legs burned with the effort. He welcomed the physical discomfort as a distraction from the lingering adrenaline of the bear sighting. When he finally reached the clearing that marked Pine Meadow Overlook, the view momentarily banished all thoughts of bears from his mind. From this vantage point, nearly 1,000 feet above the valley floor, the landscape unfolded like a living map. The morning haze had burned away, revealing the glittering surface of Lake Placid in the distance, surrounded by the rolling peaks of the High Peaks wilderness. Carlos took several deep breaths, allowing the grandeur to wash over him. This was why he'd come here, to reconnect with something larger than himself, larger than the sometimes overwhelming responsibility of caring for human lives. He took out his phone again to capture the panorama, then checked the time. It was just past 7, and he estimated he'd need about 40 minutes to complete the loop back to his cabin. Plenty of time to shower and head into Lake Placid for breakfast at one of the cafes he'd spotted during yesterday's drive-in. The descent from the overlook was more technical than the climb had been, with the trail cutting across the slope in switchbacks to manage the grade. Carlos picked his way carefully over exposed roots and rocks, mindful that a twisted ankle out here alone would be more than an inconvenience. The forest was denser on this side of the ridge, with towering white pines creating a high canopy that limited undergrowth and offered good visibility through the woods. Around him, the forest was fully awake now. Squirrels chattered indignantly as he passed, and overhead a pileated woodpecker announced its territory with a staccato drumming that echoed through the trees. Carlos had replaced his earbud but kept the volume low, unwilling to completely surrender his auditory awareness after the bear encounter. The trail curved away from the ridge and began to follow a small creek that tumbled down the mountainside in a series of miniature cascades. The sound of running water added to the sense of serenity that was gradually returning as the distance from the bear sighting increased. Carlos found himself settling back into an easier rhythm, though still more alert than he'd been at the start of his run. It happened in an instant. One moment he was alone on the trail, and the next, a dark shape exploded from behind a fallen log about 30 yards ahead. Carlos's brain processed several things simultaneously. The unmistakable form of a black bear, larger than the one he'd seen earlier, the strange, huffing vocalizations it was making, and the presence of movement behind it. 2 small cubs scrambling over the log in their mother's wake. A mother with cubs, the most dangerous bear encounter scenario. Unlike the first bear, this one had definitely seen him. The sow rose onto her hind legs, standing nearly 6 feet tall, her attention laser-focused on the perceived threat to her young. The cubs, roughly the size of beagle dogs, stayed close to their mother, clearly visible but partially obscured by her bulk. Time seemed to slow. Carlos's hand moved to the bear spray at his belt, unclipping it with trembling fingers. The logical part of his brain screamed instructions that he'd read in preparation for this trip. Make yourself look big. Don't run. Back away slowly, speak in a calm, firm voice. Hey bear, he called, trying to keep his voice steady as he raised his free arm above his head. I'm just passing through. Not interested in your cubs. The sound rather than true attacks, but as 250 pounds of muscle and fur barreled toward him at 30 miles per hour. Such academic distinctions became meaningless. Pure instinct took over. Carlos turned and ran. He knew it was wrong even as he did it. Every resource warned against running from bears. It triggers their predatory instinct, and humans can't outrun bears anyway. Black bears can reach speeds of 30 miles per hour, far faster than any human. But knowledge and action diverged in that moment of primal fear. Carlos sprinted down the trail, his feet barely touching the ground. Behind him, he could hear the crashing sounds of pursuit. The bear spray was still clutched in his right hand, forgotten in the panic of flight. The trail curved sharply around a large boulder, and Carlos followed it, his running shoes slipping slightly on the sandy soil. As he rounded the boulder, his left foot landed half on, half off the trail. His ankle rolled violently, sending a shock of pain up his leg that nearly dropped him to the ground. Carlos stumbled, but somehow maintained his footing, adrenaline temporarily masking the worst of the pain. He risked a glance over his shoulder. The bear was still coming. Ahead, the trail descended steeply through a section of dense underbrush. Carlos pushed through, branches whipping at his face and arms. The pain in his ankle was becoming impossible to ignore, each footfall sending spikes of agony up his leg. He knew he couldn't outrun the bear, especially not with an injured ankle. He needed another solution, and fast. To his right, Carlos spotted a group of large boulders, glacial erratics that had been deposited here thousands of years ago when the last ice age retreated. One particularly massive specimen formed a natural shelter, with one side rising nearly vertical for about 10 feet. It wasn't ideal, but it was the only option he had. Carlos veered off the trail, half running, half limping toward the boulder formation. The uneven ground made his injured ankle scream in protest, but fear provided powerful motivation. He reached the largest boulder and scrambled around to its far side, putting the solid mass of rock between himself and the oncoming bear. For the first time since the charge began, Carlos allowed himself to think beyond pure survival instinct. The bear spray. He raised it in his trembling hand, removing the safety clip with his thumb, as he'd practiced in his backyard before the trip. The canister felt impossibly small against the threat he faced. Pressing his back against the rock, Carlos strained to hear over the sound of his own ragged breathing. Had the bear followed him off the trail, or had he lost her in his desperate flight? Seconds stretched into a minute, then another. No sound of ursine pursuit reached his ears. Slowly, keeping his movements as quiet as possible, Carlos eased himself into a position where he could peer around the edge of the boulder. The forest seemed empty, though his view was limited by the dense underbrush. He waited, scanning methodically for any sign of movement. There, about 40 yards away back on the trail, the sow and her cubs were visible through a gap in the foliage. The mother bear was standing on her hind legs again, nose working, the air currents trying to locate the threat that had fled. The cubs pawed at the ground nearby, seemingly unconcerned with the drama unfolding around them. Carlos pulled back behind the boulder, relief washing through him in dizzying waves. He'd escaped, at least for the moment, but he was far from safe. He was injured off-trail, and there was still a protective mother bear between him and the path back to his cabin. Now that the immediate danger had passed, his ankle demanded attention. Carlos lowered himself carefully to a sitting position, extending his left leg in front of him. Even the gentle pressure of his fingers probing the injury elicited sharp stabs of pain. The ankle was already swelling, straining against the confines of his running shoe. Not broken, he thought, drawing on his medical knowledge. A sprain, but a bad one. Grade 2, possibly grade 3. He needed to elevate and ice it, neither of which was possible in his current situation. More importantly, he needed to get back to safety. Carlos checked his phone, relieved to find he had 2 bars of service. Not strong, but enough to make a call if necessary. He opened his mapping app, trying to determine the best route back to the cabin that would avoid the bear's last known position. The terrain was challenging, steep in places, with numerous small ravines cutting across the landscape. The most direct route would take him about half a mile through unmarked forest before intersecting with the trail again, well past where he'd seen the bears. It wasn't ideal, especially with an injured ankle, but it seemed safer than backtracking and potentially encountering the sow again. Carlos took a deep breath, steeling himself for what would be an uncomfortable journey. He used the boulder to help himself stand, keeping as much weight as possible off his left foot. The bear spray remained clutched in his right hand, ready for use if needed. With a final glance around the boulder to confirm the bears hadn't approached, he began the slow process of picking his way through the underbrush. Each step was an exercise in pain management. Carlos found a fallen branch that served as a makeshift walking stick, which helped somewhat but couldn't eliminate the agony that flared with every footfall. The forest floor was treacherous, covered in leaf litter that concealed dips and obstacles, making each step a potential disaster for his already compromised ankle. The morning had warmed considerably, and sweat beaded on Carlos's forehead as he struggled through the difficult terrain. He paused frequently to check his location on the phone's GPS and to listen for any sounds that might indicate the bear had circled around to find him. The forest remained quiet except for the normal chorus of birds and the occasional rustle of small animals in the underbrush. It took nearly 45 minutes to cover what would have been a 5-minute jog on the trail. When Carlos finally broke through the trees onto the familiar packed earth of the Pine Meadow Loop, the relief was so intense it made him lightheaded. He leaned heavily on his improvised walking stick, taking a moment to gather himself before continuing. According to his map, he was just over a mile from the trailhead where his journey had begun. Under normal circumstances, he could cover that distance in about 8 minutes. With his injury, he estimated it would take at least half an hour. Carlos set off at the fastest pace his ankle would allow, an awkward limping gait that was neither walking nor jogging. The downhill sections were particularly challenging, requiring him to place more weight on his injured limb than he would have liked. Each time fresh pain lanced through his ankle and up his calf. As he made his slow progress, Carlos's thoughts turned to what he would do once he reached the cabin. The swelling was concerning, and he knew from both his training and experience that proper initial treatment could significantly impact recovery time. He'd need ice, compression, elevation, the standard RICE protocol. Fortunately, he'd packed a basic first aid kit that included an elastic bandage and ibuprofen. If the injury seemed severe enough, he might need to seek medical attention in Lake Placid. The thought wasn't appealing. He'd come here to escape anything resembling a hospital, but neither was the prospect of spending his vacation completely immobilized because he'd neglected proper treatment. The final stretch of trail seemed endless. By the time the cabin came into view through the trees, Carlos's shirt was soaked with sweat, and his injured ankle felt twice its normal size. The pain had settled into a constant, throbbing presence that spiked whenever he put weight on it. He hobbled the last few yards to the cabin's porch and practically collapsed onto the wooden steps, the tension finally draining from his body now that he was back in relative safety. For several minutes, Carlos simply sat there, letting his breathing return to normal and gathering the energy to tackle the next steps. The encounter kept replaying in his mind. The mother bear's sudden appearance, the charge, his panicked flight. He knew he'd been fortunate to escape with nothing worse than a sprained ankle. Black bear attacks rarely resulted in fatalities, but they could cause serious injuries. Eventually, the practical side of his nature reasserted itself. Carlos used the porch railing to pull himself upright and limped into the cabin. He made his way to the bathroom, where he carefully removed his shoe and sock to get a better look at the injury. The ankle was swollen and beginning to bruise, a mottled palette of blue and purple spreading across his brown skin. Carlos gently palpated the area, wincing at the tenderness, but relieved to find no obvious deformities that would suggest a fracture. He filled the bathroom sink with cold water and, sitting on the edge of the tub, submerged his foot in the makeshift ice bath. The cold was shocking at first, but soon began to numb the worst of the pain. While he waited, Carlos opened his phone and began researching the nearest urgent care or emergency room. Lake Placid had a small hospital, Adirondack Medical Center, about 15 minutes' drive from the cabin. He'd go there after giving the initial home treatment some time to work. 20 minutes later, Carlos wrapped his ankle with the elastic bandage from his first aid kit, applying firm but not constricting pressure. He took 2 ibuprofen with a glass of water and hobbled to the couch, where he arranged pillows to elevate his leg above heart level. The treatment was already helping somewhat, reducing the throbbing to a more manageable ache. As he lay there, Carlos realized he should probably report the bear encounter to the local authorities. Aggressive bears, especially those that charged without provocation, could pose a danger to other hikers. He found the number for the New York Department of Environmental Conservation's regional office and dialed. After navigating an automated menu system, he reached a wildlife officer named Dave Sutton. Carlos explained what had happened: the initial sighting of a solitary bear, followed by the encounter with the mother and cubs that had resulted in the charge and his injury. "You did the right thing by reporting this," Officer Sutton said after taking down the details. "But from what you're describing, this sounds like pretty normal bear behavior, especially for a sow with cubs. She was protecting her young from what she perceived as a threat." "I wasn't threatening her cubs," Carlos protested. I was just running on the trail. To a mother bear, any human coming toward her cubs is a potential threat, Sutton explained patiently. And running, while I understand it was an instinctive reaction, probably made things worse. Bears almost always charge to intimidate, not to attack. Standing your ground and using your bear spray might have resolved the situation without you getting hurt. Carlos felt a flush of embarrassment. He knew all this in theory. He'd read the guidelines, watched the videos, but in the moment, instinct had overridden training. We'll send a ranger out to check the area and post a notice about bear activity, Sutton continued. But unless this bear shows truly unusual aggression or starts approaching developed areas looking for food, we typically don't intervene. They're wild animals in their natural habitat, after all. After ending the call, Carlos felt simultaneously relieved and somewhat disappointed. He'd done his civic duty by reporting the incident, but the officer's matter-of-fact response made his terrifying experience seem almost mundane. Just another day in the Adirondacks, where humans and bears had been negotiating their coexistence for centuries. The day was advancing, and Carlos's stomach reminded him that he hadn't eaten since the previous evening. Getting to a restaurant in Lake Placid seemed too ambitious in his current state, so he rummaged through the cabin's small kitchen, assembling a simple meal of canned soup and crackers. As he ate, he considered his next steps. The responsible thing would be to get his ankle examined by a medical professional. Even with his nursing knowledge, a proper assessment would require imaging that he couldn't perform himself. But the thought of spending hours in a waiting room, filling out paperwork, and explaining his situation to multiple healthcare providers left him feeling exhausted before he'd even begun. Carlos decided to compromise. He'd continue the RICE treatment for the rest of the day, monitoring the injury closely. If the swelling didn't begin to subside or if the pain worsened, he'd go to the hospital first thing tomorrow. In the meantime, he'd rest and recover from the shock of the encounter. After eating, Carlos moved to the bedroom where he could prop his ankle more comfortably on pillows while using his laptop. He opened his email and found 3 messages from Elena, each progressively more concerned, as he'd failed to respond to her earlier text. Carlos quickly typed a reply, downplaying the bear encounter and his injury, while reassuring her that he was fine and enjoying the peaceful mountain setting. No need to worry her unnecessarily, he reasoned, though a small voice in his head suggested he was also trying to avoid acknowledging how frightening the experience had been. The remainder of the day passed quietly. Carlos alternated between reading, napping, and refreshing the cold compress on his ankle. By late afternoon, the swelling had stabilized but showed little sign of decreasing. The bruising had expanded and darkened, creating a vivid map of the trauma on his skin. Around 5 o'clock, a knock at the door startled Carlos from a light doze. He limped across the cabin, curious about who would be visiting this relatively isolated location. Opening the door revealed a woman in the green uniform of a New York State Forest Ranger, her brown hair pulled back in a practical ponytail beneath her campaign hat. "Mr. Ramirez?" she asked. "I'm Ranger Morgan Wilson. The DEC office told me about your bear encounter this morning. I was patrolling in the area and thought I'd stop by to check on you and get some additional details." Carlos invited her in, oddly relieved to have his experience taken seriously by someone official. Ranger Wilson noticed his limping immediately. "That looks painful," she commented as Carlos lowered himself back onto the couch. "Have you had it checked out?" "Not yet," Carlos admitted. "I'm a nurse, so I've been treating it myself. RICE protocol: rest, ice, compression, elevation." Ranger Wilson nodded approvingly. "Good approach, but you might want to get an X-ray just to be safe. The Adirondack Medical Center in Lake Placid has an urgent care that's usually pretty quick." She took out a small notebook and asked Carlos to walk her through the encounter in detail, where exactly it happened, the bear's behavior and his response. Carlos described both bear sightings, feeling a renewed surge of adrenaline as he recounted the mother bear's charge. "Black bears with cubs can be particularly defensive," Ranger Wilson explained when he'd finished, "but actual attacks are extremely rare. In almost every case, a charge is a bluff designed to drive away the perceived threat." "So I should have stood my ground?" Carlos asked, the question that had been bothering him since his conversation with Officer Sutton. "Ideally, yes," she replied, "but I understand why you ran. It's a natural response when something that big is coming at you. The important thing is that you're okay aside from the ankle." She made some notes, then pulled out a small pamphlet titled "Living with Black Bears in New York" and handed it to Carlos. "This has some good information about bear behavior and safety tips. We've posted warning signs at the trailheads about the sow and cubs, but we won't be taking any action against the bears unless their behavior becomes truly problematic." Before leaving, Ranger Wilson gave Carlos her card with her direct number. "Call if you have any questions or if you spot the bears again, and seriously consider getting that ankle looked at." After she left, Carlos felt simultaneously reassured and somewhat foolish. The ranger's professional but matter-of-fact attitude reinforced what Officer Sutton had implied. His terrifying encounter was, from a wildlife management perspective, a non-event. Bears being bears, humans entering bear territory and experiencing the natural consequences. Evening settled over the cabin, the fading light casting long shadows through the windows. Carlos ordered delivery from a pizza place in Lake Placid that, according to their website, served the cabin's area. While waiting, he browsed local news, websites, half expecting to see some mention of a bear encounter in the region. There was nothing. The pizza arrived, delivered by a teenager who seemed completely unfazed by the remote location or the lateness of the hour. Carlos tipped generously, appreciating the convenience all the more given his limited mobility. As he ate, he found himself repeatedly glancing out the windows into the gathering darkness, a new wariness having taken root in his psyche. Later, as he prepared for bed, Carlos decided to take Ranger Wilson's advice. He'd go to the urgent care in Lake Placid first thing tomorrow to have his ankle properly examined. The swelling hadn't decreased, and while the ibuprofen dulled the pain, it returned with a vengeance whenever the medication wore off. Sleep came fitfully that night. Each time Carlos drifted off, his dreams filled with dark shapes moving through trees, the sound of breaking branches and the sensation of falling. He woke repeatedly, heart pounding before recognizing the safety of the cabin around him. By morning, he felt almost as exhausted as he had after the encounter itself. The urgent care at Adirondack Medical Center opened at 8. Carlos arrived at 8:15, having navigated the drive one-handed while his left foot remained inactive, using only his right for the gas and brake pedals. The waiting room was nearly empty, a middle-aged couple and a mother with a sniffling child the only other patients. The intake process was efficient, with Carlos's nursing background allowing him to describe his injury with precise medical terminology that the intake nurse clearly appreciated. Within 20 minutes, he was in an exam room, ankle elevated on a padded stool, waiting for the provider. Dr. Melissa Chen, a woman perhaps 10 years his senior with streaks of gray in her black hair, entered with a tablet in hand. "Mr. Ramirez, I understand you had an unfortunate encounter with one of our local residents." Carlos smiled despite himself. "If by resident you mean a very large black bear, then yes." Dr. Chen examined his ankle with practiced efficiency, asking him to attempt various movements and noting his pain responses. "The good news is that I don't think it's broken," she said, "but we'll get an X-ray to be sure. This is definitely a significant sprain. The ligaments have been stretched, possibly torn. Grade 2, I'd say." The X-ray confirmed her assessment: no fractures, but significant soft tissue swelling consistent with a Grade 2 sprain. Dr. Chen prescribed a more potent anti-inflammatory medication, fitted Carlos with a proper ankle brace, and provided him with crutches to use for at least the next 72 hours. "Keep weight off it as much as possible for 3 days, she advised. "Continue with ice and elevation. After that, you can begin gradually putting weight on it as tolerated, but use the brace for support. Full recovery typically takes 4 to 6 weeks. Carlos thanked her, oddly grateful for the professional confirmation of what he'd already diagnosed himself. There was something reassuring about being the patient rather than the provider, at least in this limited context. "Oh, and one more thing," Dr. Chen added as she prepared to leave. "Local reporter from the Lake Placid News is here doing a story on summer injuries. Given your unique cause of injury, would you be willing to talk to her briefly? Completely your choice, of course." Carlos hesitated. He wasn't particularly seeking attention for what increasingly felt like an embarrassing overreaction to a normal wildlife encounter. On the other hand, his story might help other hikers avoid similar situations. "Sure," he agreed finally. "Why not?" 10 minutes later, a young woman with curly red hair and a notebook introduced herself as Jessica Winters from the Lake Placid News. Her enthusiasm was palpable, as she asked Carlos to recount his bear encounter. "It's perfect for our summer safety series," she explained. "We're covering everything from water accidents to hiking mishaps, but a bear story, that's going to grab readers' attention." Carlos gave her a condensed version of events, emphasizing what he'd learned about proper bear safety and his mistake in running rather than standing his ground. Jessica took notes rapidly, occasionally asking him to clarify details. "So, basically you were lucky to escape with just a sprained ankle," she summarized when he'd finished. "I wouldn't say lucky," Carlos corrected gently. "The statistics on black bear attacks show they're extremely rare. The bear was behaving normally, protecting her cubs. I was the one who made a mistake by running." Jessica nodded, though Carlos wasn't sure his nuance would survive the editing process. "Can I get a photo of you with the ankle brace?" she asked. "It would really help illustrate the story." Carlos agreed, though he drew the line at hoisting his injured leg for a more dramatic shot. After she left, promising the article would appear in the next day's edition, Carlos collected his prescription from the hospital pharmacy and made his way back to the cabin, crutches awkwardly jammed into the passenger seat beside him. The remainder of the day passed quietly as Carlos adjusted to his limited mobility. He called his supervisor at Albany Medical Center to explain the situation, arranging to extend his time off by 2 additional days to give his ankle a chance to improve before returning to the physically demanding work of nursing. His boss was understanding, if a bit amused by the circumstances. "Only you would go on vacation and find the one bear in the Adirondacks having a bad day," she joked. "Apparently there are about 8,000 black bears in New York," Carlos informed her, "and they're actually quite common in the Adirondacks. Well, try not to meet any more of them," his boss replied. "We need you back here in one piece." By evening, Carlos had settled into a new routine of hobbling between couch, bedroom, and kitchen on his crutches. The stronger medication was helping with the pain, though it left him feeling slightly disconnected, as if observing his own movements from a distance. He ordered delivery again, Chinese food this time, and spent the evening streaming a documentary series about mountain wildlife that now held a more personal interest. The next morning, Carlos awoke to the notification sound of his phone. Eleanor had sent him a link to the Lake Placid news website with the message, "Famous already? Mom's gonna freak out." The article, titled "Local Nurse's Close Call with Adirondack Black Bear," appeared prominently on the newspaper's digital homepage. Carlos opened it with a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. The piece was brief, barely 400 words, and generally accurate, though it described his encounter as a narrow escape and referred to the bear as aggressive, terms that made Carlos wince given what he now understood about normal bear behavior. The accompanying photo showed him looking somewhat uncomfortable, standing on crutches with his braced ankle visible. The comment section beneath the article had already accumulated several responses, mostly from locals sharing their own bear encounters or offering additional safety advice. One commenter, identifying themselves as a seasonal park employee, gently criticized the article's dramatic tone. "Black bears rarely attack humans, even when they charge. This kind of reporting makes people unnecessarily fearful of wildlife." Carlos found himself agreeing with the sentiment. While his experience had certainly been frightening, he now recognized it as a natural outcome of human-wildlife interaction rather than a malicious attack. The mother bear had been protecting her cubs, behaving exactly as evolution had programmed her to behave. He was the interloper in her territory, not the other way around. Still, seeing the incident described in print, becoming part of the local news cycle, however briefly, gave the experience a strange weight. It had happened. He had the injury, the medical bills, and now the newspaper article to prove it. The next 2 days passed uneventfully, as Carlos's ankle began the slow process of healing. The swelling gradually subsided, though the colorful bruising expanded before it began to fade. He ventured into Lake Placid once more for supplies and a proper meal at a restaurant overlooking Mirror Lake, finding that the locals had already moved on from his minor celebrity. No one recognized him from the article or asked about his prominently braced ankle. On his final morning at the cabin, Carlos sat on the porch with a cup of coffee, watching the sun rise over the trees. His encounter now felt both immediate and distant, like a vivid dream that loses its power in daylight. He would return to Albany today, to his apartment and his job, and the rhythms of his normal life. Yet he knew something had shifted within him, a new awareness of his place in the natural world, a reminder of how quickly circumstances could change. Before leaving, Carlos made 2 purchases online: a set of bear bells that hikers attached to their clothing to alert wildlife of their presence, and a GPS tracker that would allow family members to monitor his location in real time during future outdoor excursions. Practical precautions, not fear-based reactions, he told himself. The drive back to Albany gave Carlos time to reflect. The trip hadn't provided the peaceful retreat he'd imagined, but it had offered something perhaps more valuable, a genuine encounter with wilderness on its own terms. He would return to the Adirondacks, he decided. The mountains and forests had too much beauty to be avoided because of one frightening experience. But next time he would come with greater respect for the inhabitants whose home he was visiting, and with the humility to recognize his status as a guest rather than an entitled tourist. As Carlos's car wound down from the mountains toward the Hudson Valley, miles away, a black bear sow and her 2 cubs foraged peacefully in a berry-filled meadow, unconcerned with the brief human drama that had interrupted their lives. The mother occasionally raised her head to test the air for threats, but finding none, returned to the essential business of preparing her young for the coming winter. In the vast continuity of the Adirondack wilderness, their encounter with the running man had already faded into the background, one small moment in the ancient dance between human and wild that continued unabated in these mountains as it had for countless generations before. Miles separated them now, the nurse and the bear, each returning to the patterns of existence that defined them. Yet for one of them, the memory would remain, a reminder of vulnerability, of respect, and of the thin veneer of separation between the world of human convenience and the older, deeper rhythms of the natural world. Carlos's ankle would heal, the story would fade from local memory, but something of the wilderness would remain with him, a shadow moving just beyond the edge of everyday consciousness, reminding him of larger truths that transcended the boundaries of his human experience. Now let's move on to the story of the next survivor. The late May sunshine warmed Linda Harper's shoulders as she knelt in the soft earth of her vegetable garden. At 60, she found a particular joy in the simplicity of gardening that she hadn't appreciated during her 35 years as an elementary school principal in Burlington. Retirement had granted her the luxury of time, and she'd chosen to spend it nurturing life from the soil of her 3-acre property nestled in the wooded hills outside Stowe, Vermont. Just a few more seedlings, she murmured to herself, patting the dirt around a fragile tomato plant. Her knees protested as she shifted position, but the discomfort was worth it. By August, these plants would yield plump red fruits that would make her homemade pasta sauce the envy of the neighborhood potlucks. Linda had moved to this rural property 2 years ago after her husband Mark's passing. Their modest retirement savings, combined with the sale of their suburban home, had afforded her this peaceful retreat. A small 2-bedroom, cedar-sided house with a wraparound porch and enough land to experiment with the extensive garden she'd always dreamed of cultivating. The property backed up to a stretch of dense Vermont forest that climbed steadily up the slopes of the nearby mountains. The gardening gloves she wore, a Christmas gift from her daughter Melissa, were already stained with dirt as she reached for another seedling from the plastic tray beside her. A cardinal called from a nearby maple tree, its bright red plumage flashing between the leaves. Linda smiled, appreciating these small moments of connection with nature that had been so rare during her working years in the city. She hummed softly, an old James Taylor song that Mark used to play on their record player as she continued planting. The perimeter of her garden was defined by a simple chicken wire fence, more a symbolic boundary than genuine protection from the local wildlife. She'd had trouble with rabbits last summer, but nothing serious enough to warrant more substantial barriers. The tomatoes were the last plants to go in the ground today. Linda had already spent the morning setting in rows of bell peppers, zucchini, and cucumber seedlings. Her back garden faced south, catching sunlight for most of the day, and she carefully planned the layout to maximize growing space while keeping similar plants grouped together. She was so absorbed in her work that she didn't immediately notice the silence that had fallen around her. The birds had stopped singing, and even the constant background rustle of leaves in the breeze seemed to have hushed. It was only when she reached for her water bottle and paused to take a drink that Linda sensed something had changed. Linda scanned her surroundings, squinting slightly in the late afternoon light. The tree line was about 50 yards from her garden, a wall of green maple, birch and pine that marked the boundary between her cultivated land and the wilderness beyond. Nothing seemed out of place, but an instinctive caution made her set down her trowel and slowly rise to her feet. That's when she saw it. A black bear, its coat glossy in the sunlight, had emerged at the edge of the trees. Linda's breath caught in her throat. The bear wasn't particularly large, probably a young adult, she guessed, but it was unmistakably wild and powerful. Its head swung from side to side as it tested the air, and then its gaze fixed directly on her. Linda knew about black bears, of course. Anyone who lived in rural Vermont developed a healthy respect for the local wildlife. They weren't typically aggressive toward humans unless threatened or protecting cubs. She quickly scanned around the bear, but saw no signs of any young. This appeared to be a solitary animal, perhaps drawn by the scent of her lunch, a peanut butter sandwich and apple she'd eaten earlier, carefully disposing of the waste in her sealed compost bin. The proper response, she knew, was to make yourself look larger, make noise, and back away slowly without turning your back. "Hey, bear," she called out, trying to keep her voice steady and authoritative despite the rapid pounding of her heart. "Go on now. Go back to the woods." The bear didn't move, continuing to watch her with what seemed like curious interest. Linda raised her arms above her head, making herself appear larger, and spoke more firmly. "Hey, get out of here! Go on!" For a moment, it seemed to work. The bear took a step back toward the tree line, and Linda felt a surge of relief. But then something changed. Perhaps it was a shift in the wind carrying different scents, or maybe something in her posture triggered a response. But the bear suddenly dropped to all fours and began moving toward her with purpose. "No!" Linda shouted, clapping her hands loudly. She took several steps backward, still facing the animal, her gardening gloves still on her hands. The chicken wire fence of her garden was between them, but she knew it would provide no real obstacle to a determined bear. Her house was about 30 yards behind her, but making a run for it might trigger the bear's chase instinct. The bear increased its pace, and Linda's calm began to fracture. She looked around, desperately for anything that might help. Her gardening tools and a trowel, pruners, and a small rake lay scattered around the garden bed. Nothing that would be useful against several 100 pounds of wild animal. "Get back!" she shouted again, her voice cracking with fear as the bear reached the edge of her garden fence. Yet paused there, seeming to consider the flimsy barrier, then pushed through with frightening ease, the chicken wire bending and snapping under its weight. Linda took several more steps backward, stumbling slightly on the uneven ground. The bear was now inside her garden, its massive paws crushing the seedlings she'd just planted. It seemed agitated now, perhaps confused by the human sounds and smells, its head swinging from side to side. In a surge of desperation, Linda remembered the air horn she kept in the garage for emergencies, but it might as well have been miles away. Mark had always insisted they keep bear spray on hand during hiking trips, but she hadn't thought it necessary for gardening in her own backyard. The bear lunged forward suddenly, and Linda turned to run. It was instinct overriding knowledge, the primal urge to flee danger. She managed only 3 steps before she felt a powerful impact against her back that sent her sprawling face first onto the ground. The fall knocked the wind from her lungs, and pain shot through her as her wrist twisted unnaturally beneath her. Linda rolled onto her back, gasping for breath, to find the bear looming over her. Its breath was hot and carried a wild, musky scent that filled her nostrils. Terror paralyzed her as the massive head lowered toward her face, close enough that she could see the individual hairs of its muzzle and the startling intelligence in its small, dark eyes. Then, inexplicably, it backed away a few steps. Linda remained frozen, afraid that any movement might provoke another attack. The bear pawed at the ground, destroying more of her carefully planted garden, then turned its attention to her small gardening bag. With one swipe of its powerful claws, it tore open the canvas tote, scattering her supplies and investigating the granola bar she'd tucked inside for an afternoon snack. While the bear was distracted, Linda slowly, painfully pushed herself backward, with her feet, using only her uninjured arm for support. Each movement sent waves of agony through her wrist, which was already swelling visibly. She bit her lip to keep from crying out, tasting blood as she continued her painstaking retreat. The bear finished the granola bar in 2 bites, wrapper and all, then returned its attention to Linda. It approached again, this time more slowly, its nose working to process her scent. Linda closed her eyes, certain that this was it, that after 60 years of life her story would end here in her beloved garden, alone, except for this wild creature that couldn't comprehend the life it was about to extinguish. But instead of teeth and claws, she felt the bear's rough tongue lick her exposed ankle, perhaps tasting the salt on her skin. It snuffled around her feet, then lost interest and wandered back toward the destroyed garden beds. Linda remained motionless, barely breathing, as the bear methodically destroyed what remained of her vegetable plants, seemingly searching for more food. After what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, the bear appeared to lose interest. With one final look in her direction, it lumbered back toward the woods, pushing through the remains of the chicken wire fence and disappearing into the trees as suddenly as it had appeared. Linda waited several more minutes, listening intently for any sounds of the bear's return. Her wrist throbbed mercilessly, and she could feel warm blood trickling from scrapes on her knees and palms. Slowly, painfully, she pulled herself to her feet and staggered toward the house, cradling her injured wrist against her chest. Inside, she fumbled with her phone, her hands shaking so badly she could barely dial. When the 911 operator answered, Linda's voice came out as a hoarse whisper. "I've been attacked by a bear. I'm alone and injured. Please send help." The dispatcher's calm voice guided her through the next steps, locking all doors and windows, elevating her injured wrist, applying ice, and waiting for emergency services. Linda provided her address and described her injuries as best she could, her mind still reeling from the encounter. "Ma'am, are you sure it was a bear?" the dispatcher asked, a note of skepticism in her voice. Black bears rarely attack humans without provocation. "I'm sure," Linda said firmly, though the question made her momentarily doubt her own experience. "It was definitely a black bear, medium-sized. It knocked me down and then it just left." "Emergency services are on their way, Miss Harper. They should be there in about 15 minutes. Please stay on the line with me until they arrive." Linda sank into her kitchen. "Chair?" The phone pressed to her ear as the adrenaline began to ebb from her system. The pain in her wrist intensified, and she noticed for the first time the dirt and blood caked on her clothing. Through the kitchen window, she could see her devastated garden, flattened plants, scattered tools, and the mangled chicken wire fence, tangible evidence that she hadn't imagined the terrifying encounter. The emergency responders arrived 14 minutes later, a police cruiser followed by an ambulance. They found Linda exactly where she'd been sitting, phone still clutched in her good hand, staring out at the ruined garden. "Miss Harper," a young police officer approached cautiously. "I'm Officer Reynolds. Can you tell me what happened?" Linda recounted the encounter in a detached voice, as though she were describing something that had happened to someone else. The paramedics examined her wrist, confirming it was likely fractured and would require X-rays. They cleaned the various scrapes and cuts on her hands and knees, asking questions about her medical history and allergies as they worked. "We need to report this to Fish and Wildlife," Officer Reynolds said, scribbling notes in a small pad. "Bear attacks are rare around here. They'll want to investigate." Linda nodded absently, wincing as the paramedics splinted her wrist. Will they kill it?" she asked suddenly, surprised by her own question. "Not necessarily," Reynolds replied. "Depends on the circumstances. If it's a bear that's become habituated to humans or is showing unusually aggressive behavior, they might have to relocate or euthanize it. But from what you've described, this sounds like a chance encounter. The bear could have done a lot more damage if it wanted to." That thought provided little comfort as the paramedics helped her into the ambulance. Before the doors closed, Linda caught one last glimpse of her home, the garden she'd worked so hard to create, now a trampled mess. The peaceful retirement she'd envisioned suddenly complicated by the reality of living alongside wild predators. The ride to Copley Hospital in Morrisville took just under 20 minutes. Linda stared at the ambulance ceiling, replaying the encounter in her mind, wondering if there was something she could have done differently. Should she have made more noise earlier? Retreated to the house at the first sign of the bear? Installed a more substantial fence? The questions tumbled through her mind, unanswerable and exhausting. At the hospital, X-rays confirmed a distal radius fracture, a broken wrist that would require a cast. The emergency room doctor, a woman about Linda's age with kind eyes and silver-streaked hair, examined the images on a computer screen. "You're lucky," she said, turning to Linda with a small smile. "Here, it's a clean break. No surgery needed. We'll set it, put you in a cast for about 6 weeks, and you should heal just fine." Lucky wasn't exactly how Linda would have described herself at that moment, but she nodded anyway. "What about rabies?" she asked suddenly, remembering the bear's tongue on her ankle. The doctor shook her head. "Bears rarely carry rabies. The scrapes you have don't appear to be from bites or deep scratches, but we'll clean them thoroughly just to be safe. Tetanus is more of a concern. When was your last booster?" Linda couldn't remember, so they administered a tetanus shot along with painkillers before setting her wrist. The procedure was uncomfortable despite the local anesthetic, and Linda closed her eyes, trying to focus on anything but the sensation of her bones being manipulated back into alignment. By the time they finished applying the cast, a light blue, fiberglass that extended from her knuckles to just below her elbow, it was early evening. The hospital staff offered to keep her overnight for observation, but Linda declined. She wanted to be home, even if that home now felt somewhat less safe than it had that morning. "Is there someone who can stay with you tonight?" the doctor asked, concern evident in her expression. "You've had quite a shock, and those pain medications are going to make you drowsy." Linda thought of her daughter Melissa, who lived in Boston with her husband and 2 children. "My daughter," she said finally. "She's a few hours away, but I can call her." While waiting for discharge paperwork, Linda used the hospital phone to call Melissa. Her daughter answered on the 3rd ring, her voice immediately brightening upon hearing Linda's. "Mom, I was just thinking about you. How's the garden coming along?" Linda hesitated, suddenly unsure how to explain what had happened without causing undue panic. "There's been a bit of an incident." "Honey," she said carefully, "I'm okay, but I've had a run-in with a bear in the backyard." The silence on the other end lasted several seconds. "A bear," Melissa repeated finally. "What do you mean, a run-in?" "It came out of the woods while I was gardening, knocked me down. I've broken my wrist, but otherwise I'm fine, really," she added, trying to sound more confident than she felt. "You're in the hospital." Melissa's voice had risen an octave. "Just for the cast. They're discharging me now, but the doctor suggested I shouldn't be alone tonight. I hate to ask, but—" "I'm already packing a bag," Melissa interrupted. "I'll be there in 4 hours. Don't go home alone, Mom. Wait for me at the hospital if you have to." Linda felt a wave of relief mixed with guilt. "Thank you, honey. I'm sorry to disrupt your week." "Don't be ridiculous. Text me the hospital details. I'm on my way." After hanging up, Linda discussed the situation with the discharge nurse, who assured her she could wait in the hospital lobby until her daughter arrived. As they finalized the paperwork, a new visitor appeared, a uniformed officer from the Vermont Fish and Wildlife Department. "Ms. Harper, I'm Warden James Sutton. Mind if I ask you a few questions about your bear encounter?" Warden Sutton was a tall man with a weathered face and calm demeanor that suggested years of experience with both wildlife and people. He sat beside Linda in the hospital lobby, recording her account of the encounter on a small digital device while taking additional notes by hand. "Any cubs present?" he asked after she'd finished her story. "No, it was alone." "And you're certain it was a black bear, not unusually large or colored?" Linda nodded. "Definitely a black bear. Not fully grown, I don't think. Maybe 300 pounds. It was hard to judge the size in retrospect, her memory clouded by fear and adrenaline. "Did you have food with you in the garden? Bird feeders nearby? Garbage cans accessible?" The questions continued, methodical and detailed. Linda described her property, the chicken wire fence, her lunch, the compost bin. With each question, she felt a growing sense of defensiveness, as though she were somehow being blamed for the attack. "I've lived there 2 years without any problems," she said finally. "I know bears are around. It's Vermont after all, but I've never even seen one on my property before today." Warden Sutton nodded sympathetically. "Black bear populations are expanding in Vermont, and encounters are becoming more common. From what you've described, this sounds like a curious bear that got startled when you tried to frighten it away. Unfortunately, sometimes their curiosity can lead to dangerous situations." "Will you catch it?" Linda asked. "We'll investigate the area, look for signs of the bear, set up some cameras. If it appears to be a problem bear that's actively seeking human food sources or showing aggressive behavior patterns, we might try to trap and relocate it. But honestly, Ms. Harper, there are a lot of black bears in those woods, and determining which specific one visited your property would be challenging." It wasn't what Linda wanted to hear. Part of her had hoped for a definitive resolution, the bear caught and removed, eliminating any chance of a repeat encounter. But nature, she was learning, rarely offered such clean solutions. "What can I do to prevent this from happening again?" she asked instead. Warden Sutton pulled a pamphlet from his shirt pocket and handed it to her. "This covers the basics of bear-proofing your property. Secure trash cans, don't leave pet food outside, take down bird feeders during bear season, April through November. For your garden, you might want to consider an electric fence. They're very effective deterrents." Linda looked down at the colorful brochure, feeling overwhelmed by this new reality. The peaceful retirement she'd envisioned now seemed complicated by invisible rules and precautions she hadn't fully considered when purchasing her rural property. "I know it's a lot to process," Sutton said kindly, noticing her expression. "Bears are generally shy animals that want to avoid humans. This encounter was unusual, but taking some precautions will greatly reduce the chances of it happening again." He gave her his card with a direct number to call if she spotted the bear again or had additional questions. As he stood to leave, he paused. "You mentioned you're alone at the property?" Linda nodded. "It might be worth investing in some bear spray to keep on hand, especially when you're gardening, and an air horn can be effective too. Loud noises usually send bears running." After Warden Sutton left, Linda sat quietly in the hospital lobby, mentally cataloging everything she would need to do differently now. The cast on her wrist was beginning to itch, a persistent reminder of how quickly her circumstances had changed. Just that morning, her biggest concern had been whether the tomato seedlings would take root properly. Melissa arrived shortly after 9 o'clock, rushing into the lobby with the focused energy Linda recognized from her daughter's childhood soccer games. At 35, Melissa was a successful marketing executive with her mother's practical nature and her father's expressive eyes. She wrapped Linda in a careful hug, mindful of the cast. "Mom, you look awful," she said bluntly, then immediately softened. "I mean, you've obviously been through something terrible. Are you really okay?" Linda mustered a smile. "I'm fine, honey. Just shaken up and feeling a bit foolish. I should have been more careful." Melissa frowned. "This isn't your fault. Come on, let's get you home. You can tell me everything in the car." The drive back to Linda's house was filled with Melissa's questions and barely concealed concern. Linda provided abbreviated answers, suddenly exhausted by the events of the day and the effects of the pain medication. As they pulled into her driveway, the headlights swept across the front of the house, everything looking deceptively normal in the darkness. "I'll check inside first," Melissa insisted, taking the house, keys from Linda's uninjured hand. "Just wait here a minute." Linda didn't argue, watching from the car as Melissa unlocked the front door and flipped on lights throughout the house. A few minutes later, her daughter returned. "All clear. Not that I expected a bear to be sitting in your living room, but still." Inside, everything was exactly as Linda had left it in her panicked exit. A half-empty cup of tea on the counter, her gardening magazine open on the coffee table, reading glasses perched on top. The normalcy was jarring compared to the chaos of the day. Melissa efficiently set about making up the guest room for herself and preparing a light dinner neither of them had much appetite for. Linda sat at the kitchen table, staring out the window into the darkness where she knew her ruined garden lay. "I'll help you clean it up tomorrow," Melissa said, following her gaze. "We can salvage what's left of the plants, maybe." Linda shook her head. "It's not just the garden, I don't know if I can explain it. Something fundamental has changed. I've always felt safe here." Melissa sat down across from her, reaching out to cover Linda's good hand with her own. "One encounter doesn't define this place, Mom. It was a fluke. We'll take precautions, make some adjustments. If thousands of other Vermonters can coexist with bears, so can you." Linda appreciated her daughter's practical approach, even if it couldn't quite touch the deeper unease she felt. They finished their meal in comfortable silence, and Linda took her prescribed pain medication before heading to bed. Despite her exhaustion, sleep proved elusive. Every creak of the house, every rustle of wind through the trees outside her window jolted her to alertness. She kept picturing the bear's face inches from her own, feeling its hot breath, seeing the intelligence in its dark eyes. When she finally drifted off near dawn, her dreams were populated by shadowy forests and pursuing predators that always remained just out of sight. Morning arrived with soft May sunshine and birdsong. For a blissful moment upon waking, Linda forgot the events of the previous day, until she tried to push herself up and pain shot through her casted wrist. Reality came rushing back, and with it, the memory of fear. Melissa was already awake, the smell of coffee and pancakes drifting from the kitchen. Linda made her way downstairs slowly, still unsteady from the medication and poor sleep. "Morning," Melissa said cheerfully, sliding a cup of coffee across the counter with one hand, while flipping pancakes with the other. "How are you feeling?" "Like I wrestled a bear and lost," Linda replied, attempting humor that fell flat even to her own ears. After breakfast, they ventured outside to assess the damage to the garden. In daylight, it looked even worse than Linda had remembered. The chicken wire fence was mangled beyond repair, tomato and pepper seedlings crushed into the dirt, and deep paw prints marked the soft soil. Her garden tools lay scattered and broken, and the canvas tote bag had been shredded. "Well," Melissa said after a moment of silence, "I guess we're making a Home Depot run today." They spent the morning clearing debris and salvaging what few plants remained undamaged. With her dominant right hand in a cast, Linda could do little more than direct Melissa's efforts, which frustrated her immensely. By noon, they had cleared most of the destruction, leaving bare soil where Linda's carefully planned garden had been. "I was thinking," Melissa said as they took a break on the porch, glasses of iced tea sweating beside them. "Maybe we should look into that electric fence the wildlife warden mentioned, and I saw some motion-activated floodlights at the hardware store. That might help too." Linda nodded absently, her gaze fixed on the tree line where the bear had emerged. Was it watching them even now, hidden in the shadows between the trunks? "Mom?" Melissa's voice pulled her back. "Where did you go just now?" "Sorry, just thinking." Linda sighed, flexing her fingers where they protruded from the cast. "I know you need to get back to Boston soon. I'm sorry to have disrupted your week like this." Melissa waved away the apology. "I've already called work. I'm staying through. The weekend, at least. We'll get you set up with better security, replant what we can, and make sure you're comfortable managing with that cast before I go anywhere." Linda felt a rush of gratitude for her daughter's practical support, even as a part of her worried about becoming a burden. Since Mark's death, she'd worked hard to maintain her independence, to prove to herself and her family that she could build a fulfilling life on her own terms. Now, one wild encounter had left her feeling vulnerable in a way she hadn't expected. The afternoon brought a flurry of visitors. First came Officer Reynolds, checking in and bringing a copy of the police report for Linda's insurance company. He mentioned that Fish and Wildlife had set up trail cameras near her property line to monitor for bear activity. Next was Linda's nearest neighbor, Eleanor Peterson, a retired nurse who lived about half a mile down the road. She arrived carrying a casserole and wide-eyed curiosity. "I heard about your bear on the police scanner," Eleanor explained, setting the food on the counter. "Whole town's talking about it. You're something of a local celebrity now." Linda grimaced. "Not the kind of fame I was looking for." "Well, it certainly breaks up the usual gossip about property taxes and whose grandkid got into which college." Eleanor peered at Linda's cast. "Nasty break? Copley do a good job setting it?" The conversation continued in this vein, with Eleanor probing for details of the encounter, while Linda provided abbreviated answers. It was exhausting being the center of attention, especially for something she'd rather forget. After Eleanor left, promising to check in again soon, Linda turned to Melissa with a weary expression. "Is this what I have to look forward to now? Being known as the crazy bear lady?" Melissa laughed. "Could be worse. You could be the lady who claims to have been abducted by aliens. At least there's physical evidence of your bear." The comment was meant to lighten the mood, but it touched on something that had been nagging at Linda. Despite the clear evidence of destruction in her garden, she had no proof of what had actually happened, no photos of the bear, no witnesses to the attack. Just her word and a broken wrist that could have resulted from any fall. Her thoughts were interrupted by the ringing of the doorbell, their third visitor of the day. This time it was a young woman with a press badge and a cameraman in tow. "Miss Harper, I'm Allison Kent from WCX News. We heard about your bear encounter and wondered if you'd be willing to share your story with our viewers." Bear safety is an important issue for many Vermonters. Linda instinctively stepped back from the door, looking to Melissa for help. Her daughter smoothly intervened. "My mother is still recovering from her injuries and isn't up for an interview today," Melissa said firmly. "Perhaps another time." The reporter was persistent. "It would only take a few minutes. Bear encounters are increasing across the state, and personal stories like your mother's help raise awareness about safety precautions." Linda was about to refuse again when something in the reporter's words gave her pause. If her experience could help others avoid similar situations, perhaps there was value in sharing it. And a small, slightly petty part of her liked the idea of having her story documented, evidence that she wasn't exaggerating or imagining things. 15 minutes, she said suddenly, overriding Melissa's objections. And we do it out on the porch, not inside. The interview setup took longer than the actual conversation. The cameraman positioned Linda in her porch rocker, angling the shot to capture both her cast and the damaged garden in the background. Alison Kent asked predictable questions about what happened, how Linda felt, and what she planned to do differently in the future. "Were you afraid?" the reporter asked, her expression a practiced blend of concern and curiosity. "Terrified," Linda answered honestly. "But also, I don't know, aware in a way I've never been before. Like every sense was heightened. I remember the smell of the dirt and the bear's breath, the exact shade of blue the sky was, the way time seemed to slow down. And what would you tell other Vermonters about living alongside wildlife like bears?" Linda considered the question. "I'd say, respect them, educate yourself, take precautions, but also accept that we're in their territory as much as they're in ours. What happened to me was rare, and I was lucky it wasn't worse." The cameraman gave a thumbs up, and Alison Kent thanked her for her time, promising the segment would air on the evening news the following day. As they packed up their equipment, the reporter mentioned offhandedly that they'd try to get comment from Fish and Wildlife about the likelihood of the bear returning to the area. That question lingered with Linda long after the news crew had departed. Would it come back? Was it out there now, associating her property with an easy meal? The pamphlet Warden Sutton had given her mentioned that bears could remember food sources for years and would return to successful locations. By evening, Linda's wrist was throbbing again, and the parade of visitors had left her drained. Melissa prepared a simple dinner, then helped Linda navigate the awkward process of showering with a plastic bag wrapped around her cast. "I've been thinking," Melissa said, as they settled in the living room afterward, a movie queued up on the television neither of them was really interested in watching. "What if you came to stay with us in Boston for a while? Just until your wrist heals. The kids would love having Grandma around, and you wouldn't have to worry about managing alone." Linda's immediate instinct was to refuse. Her independence was precious, hard-won after decades of balancing her needs with those of her students, her husband, her family. And yet the thought of facing the night alone in this house, jumping at every sound from the woods, was daunting. "Let me think about it," she said finally. "It's a generous offer." Melissa nodded, not pushing further, and they turned their attention to the movie. Linda found her mind wandering, considering options she hadn't thought necessary before. Could she afford to move closer to town, perhaps? Or would installing better security measures be enough to restore her sense of safety here? That night, sleep came easier with the combination of exhaustion, pain medication, and the reassuring presence of her daughter in the next room. Still, her dreams were troubled, not with bears this time, but with a persistent sense of displacement, of no longer belonging in spaces she had once claimed as her own. Morning brought a surprise visit from Warden Sutton, who arrived as they were finishing breakfast. He carried a large cardboard box and a rolled bundle of what appeared to be fencing material. "Thought I'd check in on you," he explained, setting down his burdens. "And I brought some things that might help. The department has an education program with supplies for folks who've had bear encounters." Inside the box were several items: a canister of bear spray with a holster, an air horn, and a motion-activated alarm system designed to detect large animals. The rolled bundle turned out to be lightweight but sturdy electric fence components. "This is just a temporary setup," Sutton explained, as he showed them how the fence worked. "Enough to protect your garden area. It's battery-powered, puts out a mild shock that won't harm the bear, but will definitely discourage it." Linda was touched by the gesture. "Thank you. This is incredibly helpful." Sutton smiled. "Part of the job. We want people and wildlife to coexist safely. Besides," he added, "I checked the cameras this morning. Your bear made another appearance last night, about 200 yards into the woods. Didn't come onto your property, but it's definitely still in the area." The news sent a chill through Linda. It came back? Bears are creatures of habit, and they have excellent memories for food sources. This one's likely to check your property periodically for a while, which is why these deterrents are important. He gestured to the supplies. "Make your space unappealing and it'll move on to natural food sources." After showing them how to install the electric fence, Warden Sutton departed, leaving Linda with mixed feelings. The practical support was welcome, but the confirmation that the bear remained nearby was unsettling. Melissa, ever practical, immediately set to work installing the fence around what remained of the garden area. Linda helped as best she could with one functional hand, reading instructions and holding tools. By mid-afternoon, a rectangle of thin wire surrounded the garden beds, with warning signs attached at intervals. "There," Melissa said, connecting the battery pack that would power the fence. "Let's see a bear get through that." Linda wasn't entirely convinced, but she appreciated her daughter's confidence. They spent the remainder of the afternoon replanting what they could with seedlings purchased from a garden center in Stowe. The selection was limited this late in the planting season, but they managed to find some tomato, cucumber, and zucchini plants to replace what had been destroyed. That evening, they watched the local news together on Linda's small television. As promised, the bear encounter was featured, a 3-minute segment that included portions of Linda's interview intercut with stock footage of black bears and comments from a Fish and Wildlife spokesperson about bear safety. Seeing herself on screen was surreal. The woman in the rocking chair with the blue cast seemed older and more fragile than Linda pictured herself, her voice shakier than she remembered. The reporter's voiceover described her as lucky to escape, with minor injuries, and emphasized the rarity of bear attacks in Vermont. "You came across well," Melissa said when it ended, very calm and articulate. Linda wasn't sure if calm was what she'd been aiming for. Part of her had wanted viewers to understand the terror, the vulnerability, the fundamental shift in how she now perceived her surroundings, but perhaps that wasn't something that could be conveyed in a 3-minute news segment between weather and sports. The following day was Friday, and Melissa needed to return to Boston. Her husband had been managing the children alone, and work responsibilities couldn't be postponed indefinitely. Though she offered again to take Linda back with her, Linda declined. "I need to face this," she explained, as they stood beside Melissa's packed car. "If I leave now, I'm not sure I'd have the courage to come back and live here alone." Melissa looked skeptical. "There's a difference between courage and unnecessary risk, Mom. At least promise me you'll use the bear spray and alarm system." "I promise, and I'll call you every evening so you know I'm okay." They hugged goodbye, Melissa being careful of Linda's cast, and then her daughter was driving away, leaving Linda alone with her thoughts and the newly secured property. The silence felt heavier somehow, more noticeable without Melissa's energetic presence. Linda spent the afternoon organizing the house to accommodate her limited mobility, moving frequently used items to lower shelves and setting up a chair in the bathroom to make showering easier. The pain in her wrist had subsided to a dull ache, manageable with over-the-counter medication rather than the stronger prescription pills that left her feeling foggy and disconnected. As evening approached, she found herself growing increasingly anxious. Every sound from outside seemed magnified: the wind in the trees, birds settling for the night, the distant rumble of a neighbor's truck. She double-checked the doors and windows, tested the air horn, and kept the bear spray canister within reach as she moved through the house. Dinner was a simple affair of soup and bread, eaten at the kitchen table facing the window that overlooked her partially restored garden and the new electric fence. Beyond that, the forest loomed dark and impenetrable as twilight deepened. Was the bear watching from those shadows? Had it returned to investigate the changes to its discovered food source? Linda forced herself to focus on practical matters. She called Melissa as promised to confirm she was fine. She set up the motion-activated alarm near the back door. She laid out her medication and a glass of water beside her bed. Normal actions, routine tasks that helped ground her in the familiar. Sleep was fitful that night, interrupted by both physical discomfort from the cast and the hypervigilance that seemed to have become her new normal. Twice she thought she heard the motion alarm and sat bolt upright in bed, heart pounding, only to realize it was the normal settling sounds of the house or her own imagination. By morning, exhaustion had dulled her fear somewhat. The sunlight, streaming through her bedroom window, made the night's anxieties seem overblown. Linda made her way downstairs, prepared coffee one-handed, and carried it to the porch to enjoy the early morning air. From her rocking chair, she surveyed her domain. The electric fence gleamed in the sunlight, a visible boundary between her cultivated space and the wild beyond. The newly planted seedlings stood in neat rows, a testament to resilience and new beginnings. The forest at the property's edge was alive with bird song and movement, a reminder that life continued its cycles regardless of human interruptions. As she sipped her coffee, Linda considered her options. She could sell the house, move closer to town, or even to Boston near Melissa. She could hire someone to clear more of the land, creating greater distance between her living space and the forest edge. She could invest in more substantial security measures, higher fences, brighter lights, surveillance cameras, or she could adapt, learn to coexist with the wildlife that had been here long before her retirement plans, take reasonable precautions, while accepting that absolute safety was an illusion she'd never really possessed, even in her previous suburban life. The air horn sat on the small table beside her, its bright orange plastic garish against the natural wood. The Bear spray canister was clipped to her gardening apron, which hung by the back door. New additions to her life, visible reminders of changed circumstances. Linda set down her coffee cup and flexed her fingers where they protruded from the cast. 6 weeks of limited mobility, the doctor had said. 6 weeks to heal, to adapt, to decide what came next. The tomato plants would be producing fruit by then, she calculated. If they survived, if the electric fence worked, if the bear found other feeding grounds. A lot of ifs, but life had always been full of uncertainties. She'd just been more adept at ignoring them before. Linda rose from her chair and walked to the edge of the porch, looking out at the place she'd chosen for her retirement. It was still beautiful, still peaceful in its way. The encounter with the bear hadn't changed the character of the land itself, only her perception of it. Perhaps with time she could find a new equilibrium, a modified relationship with this place that acknowledged both its beauty and its wildness. She picked up the air horn, feeling its weight in her hand. A tool, not a talisman. A reasonable precaution, not a guarantee. Linda tucked it into her pocket and descended the porch steps. The morning was cool, the grass damp with dew beneath her feet as she made her way to the garden gate. The electric fence hummed softly, a reminder of boundaries newly established. Beyond it, at the forest edge, life continued undisturbed. Somewhere in those woods, a black bear went about its day, driven by instincts and needs as valid as her own. Their paths had crossed once and might again, but perhaps next time they would each be better prepared for the encounter. Linda unlatched the gate carefully, mindful of the electric wire, and stepped into her garden. There was work to be done, adapting to new realities with one hand while keeping a watchful eye on the trees. The bear, for its part, had moved deeper into the forest, following ancient paths known only to its kind. Its encounter with the human was already fading from memory, replaced by more immediate concerns, finding food, securing territory, preparing for the eventual change of seasons. In its wake, it left only footprints that would soon wash away in the next rain, and a story that would be told and retold in the small Vermont community, growing and changing with each telling, until the truth of what had occurred that May afternoon existed only in Linda's memory and the lingering ache in her healing bones.